The wet, intermittent sound of their movements was like a rhythmic melody that covered them headlong, filling the space with passion and desire. Their bodies merged in a single dance, set at a frantic pace, as if each heartbeat was accompanied by another surge of excitement. The musky scent of sex and sweat hung thickly in the air, enveloping them like an invisible blanket, emphasizing the depth of the moment. The woman settled comfortably on the man's hips, feeling his strength, hot and dense, like an inexorable flow of energy that supported her in every movement. The warmth of his body was felt on her skin, causing a small shiver of pleasure to run along her spine. Her movements were smooth and confident, finely tuned to their shared rhythm, as if their bodies were speaking in a language only the two of them could understand. In the soft light of the room, their outlines shimmered, creating the illusion of a single being immersed in ecstasy. Every breath, every moan turned into a new note in the symphony of their passion, and their movements became more and more intense, as if they were approaching a climax that they could not and did not want to resist. She leaned forward, her long hair slid over the man's shoulders, covering his face with a light veil. Her hands found support on his strong shoulders, and this movement gave her confidence. His hands, large and strong, held her gently but firmly, as if he wanted to tell her that she was safe, that she could just be herself in this moment, without fear or doubt. She felt this protection with every cell of her body, with every exciting touch of his fingers. Their breathing merged, as if even this natural process had become part of their overall harmony. The warm air between them was filled with muffled groans and intermittent breaths, creating an atmosphere in which walls, time, and the rest of the world dissolved. They were just the two of them, sharing every second of this vibrant intimacy. "My God!" she screamed, unable to bear the emotions overwhelming her. Her voice was full of sincere surprise, joy, and delight that could not be hidden. "I didn't even know sex could be like this." As if confirming her words, a drawn-out moan escaped from her lips, full of pleasure, which was growing inside her like a wave, overwhelming her more and more. Her fingers clung tightly to his shoulders, as if she was looking for a fulcrum so as not to drown in this whirlpool of feelings. Her every movement became a little sharper, a little more desperate, as if she wanted to express through him all the storm that was playing out in her soul. "I wasted 20 years of my life," she exclaimed louder, almost breaking into a scream in which a mixture of relief and regret was heard. As if with these words she was saying goodbye to the burden of the past, letting go of what had been holding her back for a long time. This recognition became her liberation, opening the door to a new beginning, to a life in which she allowed herself to feel, desire, and be desired. Her body shuddered in a bright flash of sensations that filled her to the brim. It was more than just physical pleasure, it was something deep, penetrating to the very core of her being. Maybe she had never experienced anything like this before, or maybe she had simply forgotten what true happiness was. "Are you sure you've had a similar experience before?" he asked with a hint of slight playfulness, but there was genuine concern in his voice. His confident movements, filling her with warmth and strength, left no room for doubt. She couldn't answer in words. Her entire being at that moment was focused on feelings that could not be expressed. Instead of answering, her lips made a barely audible sound, full of warmth and gratitude. It was as if she was drowning in this moment, leaving the whole world behind her to stay only with him, the only one who gave her this unforgettable night. His scream tore through the silence of the dark and lonely room like thunder in the middle of the night, destroying the peace that had long seemed unreal. In this pitch darkness, where the walls seemed to be closing in, trying to absorb his fear and pain, Steve woke up with painful abruptness. The white cotton sheet, soaked with sweat, clung to his skin like a shackle wrapped around his body, reminding him of his failed attempt to find some peace. His hands frantically clutched the edges of the bed, in a desperate attempt to hold on to something that seemed real in the chaos of his mind. The nightmares that haunted him at night became more and more cruel and vivid, as if his consciousness was stubbornly trying to explain to him something that he refused to understand in reality. These night visions were not mere products of imagination or random fragments of daytime thoughts. They represented a kind of painful theater where the real events of his life were mixed with fictional scenes and dialogues, each of which hit directly the sore spots of his soul. These visions distorted memories, inflated doubts, making them overwhelming. They caused him horror, mixed with a feeling of humiliation, wounded pride, and a rapidly collapsing male ego. Steve, finding no other way out, covered his face with his hands, trying to gain at least some sense of security and control over himself. His fingers clenched at his temples, as if he could force all this confusion out of himself. His breathing was heavy, ragged, like that of a man who had just emerged from icy water. His heart was beating so loudly that he could hardly hear the surrounding silence. Gradually, after some time, reality began to make its way through the dense veil of his shocked consciousness. But with every moment, this reality became more and more unbearable. The hope that it was all just a bad dream, that his wife's betrayal was nothing more than a figment of a fevered imagination, melted like ice in the sun. He wanted to believe that his mind was deceiving him, that all those terrible words she had said, and that scene that was now stuck in his memory, were an illusion, a cruel joke, a trick of the mind. But no matter how hard he tried to deny it, no matter how hard he dug his nails into the skin of his face, the truth remained unchanged. She betrayed him, and her betrayal destroyed not only their marriage, but the very essence of his self-confidence. The first of many questions slowly surfaced in his exhausted mind as his eyes began to adjust to the faint darkness of the hotel room. Why? That simple word echoed in his head, causing his body to shake with another wave of emotional pain. This question was just the beginning of an avalanche of thoughts that crashed into him. What did I do wrong? Was I not man enough for her? What did she see in another person that she didn't see in me? I didn't satisfy her in bed. Or is that not the case? She fell out of love with me and needed someone else to fill the void. Each of these assumptions was like a new hammer blow to his heart, and each of them gave birth to the next. Were these 20 years a waste of time for her? Why could she so easily give up everything we built together? Why, for the sake of some fleeting affair, did she destroy our family, our life, my hopes? She didn't love me all this time, but just pretended. Or maybe I myself pushed her to this with my behavior. My head was spinning from trying to unravel the reasons for her action. He tried to dismantle his past into the smallest pieces, analyzing every detail of their marriage. Words spoken, actions taken, moments missed when he perhaps could have acted differently. Was it one terrible offense or a chain of small mistakes accumulated over the years? He couldn't find any answers. The silence in the room seemed unbearably loud to him. She only increased his loneliness and left room for even more painful thoughts. No consolation, no support. Just him, his broken soul, and the wall of questions that seemed to be getting higher every moment. The inexorable buzz of his phone interrupted his thoughts. He was sure that he had turned off the damn device, but apparently he had set it to vibrate. Another thing I didn't do right, he thought, barely suppressing the feeling of horror. He was not ready to talk to her. The problem with questions was that they would inevitably have answers, and Steve wasn't sure he was ready to hear them. A heavy foreboding gripped him, and his heart sank to his feet. At this point, he regretted last night's Mexican dinner as his stomach began to churn. Apprehensively, Steve rose from the bed to look at the caller ID. The lesser of two evils appeared on the screen, the number of the hospital where he worked. "It's 3 o'clock in the morning. I hope you have a good reason for waking me up," Steve replied, not caring who was on the other end of the phone. "Hello, buddy. Sorry to bother you so early, but the central switch has fallen. The entire hospital is without communication, and in the emergency room, a patient with a traumatic brain injury undergoes a CT scan. Pictures cannot be sent over the internet," explained Eric, one of Steve's subordinates. Steve immediately jumped out of bed, quickly getting dressed, and replied, "Fine. The PAX system is located on a separate network. Redirect the firewall to the PAX router, bypassing the central switch. This should allow the radiologist to send the images to our night team. For now, let the rest of the hospital switch to paperwork until we restore the switch. Tell the night manager I'll be there in 10 minutes. "Great idea. I didn't even think about it," Eric answered with relief. Unfortunately for Steve, life didn't stop because of a broken heart. He was needed at the hospital despite his condition. Steve was born into a Catholic family and spent his entire childhood in this environment. His parents, as religious people, always considered it important that he receive a good education in accordance with their beliefs, so they decided to send him to a private Catholic school. At first glance, this might seem like the right decision, but for Steve it turned out to be a series of difficulties. In the rural areas where they lived, private schools had neither large classes nor a diverse student body. In effect, this meant that the same group of children studied together year after year, from primary school until graduation. In such a closed social environment, any deviation from the norm or erroneous action became something of a social verdict. If you made one mistake, you could gain a reputation that would follow you throughout your school years. This unspoken verdict caught up with Steve quite early, and for him it was embodied in the form of the nickname Nerd. The reasons why he received this nickname could be different, and each of them only strengthened his role as an outcast. First of all, Steve was smart and did well in school, especially in math. While his classmates had to struggle to master the material, Steve solved problems quickly and with minimal effort. Such ease could cause envy and irritation on the part of those who struggled with every test. Secondly, his family lived quite modestly, which sharply distinguished him from other children from wealthier families. His clothes were simple, practical, and not at all fashionable, which also became a reason for ridicule. But the most devastating event was his first attempt to express his feelings. In fifth grade, Steve was madly in love with the most popular girl in school. He felt that if he did something special, he could win her attention. Inspired by his feelings, he decided to write her a love poem. Steve sincerely hoped that his lines would touch the girl's heart. However, as a child who had never heard of the intricacies of poetry, much less read Cyrano de Bergerac, he was unable to create anything sophisticated. His poem turned out to be naive, simple, and, according to his classmates, funny. When his lover received the letter, she did not appreciate the romantic gesture. On the contrary, the poem quickly became the property of the whole class. The children, with their inherent cruelty, read these lines over and over again to laugh at Steve's feelings. This episode was a real humiliation for the boy. His love not only did not find a response, but also attracted attention to him in the worst sense of the word. From that moment on, Steve found himself in the role of a laughingstock, especially among the boys and girls of the fifth grade. In the eyes of his peers, he was entrenched as a nerd, an eccentric boy who did not understand how the school world worked. Years passed, but his position remained unchanged. Steve remained in the same class with the same children, and each year only confirmed and strengthened his reputation. He accepted his fate and resigned himself to the role of an outcast. To somehow compensate for the lack of social success, he began to seek solace in the fact that he was really good at it. It was during this period that he became interested in computers. When he was first introduced to this new technology, he felt that he had a chance to achieve something significant here. Steve began to study computers with incredible zeal. He read everything he could find, experimented, and tried to understand how programs and systems worked. Unlike complicated and painful human relationships, where one mistake could cost him a lot, computers offered a comforting solution. If he made a mistake in the code, it could always be corrected. Computers gave him a sense of control and confidence, something he sorely lacked in his interactions with others. Ultimately, his immersion in studying computers became not just a hobby, but a way to escape from all the humiliations and difficulties of school life. Steve realized that although his nickname, Nerd, was seen as a joke at school, in the world of technology, it could become his greatest asset. Naturally, Steve was looking forward to graduating from high school and going to college. New friends and the opportunity to escape 12 years of hell were just the beginning of his plans. After graduating with honors from high school, Steve intended to attend a top university to study computer science. Getting a diploma and getting a job in a large company is his goal. But life decreed otherwise. At a church alumni retreat, Steve met Jill. An awkward, socially awkward young man and a lanky, unattractive girl awkwardly spent their first date. For Steve, The very fact that some girls showed interest in him was incredibly exciting. For Jill, this was the first time a guy didn't try to grope her or compare her to the popular girls at school. The main thing is that they enjoyed communicating with each other. It was easy for them to talk about personal topics. Not long later, they fell in love with each other. And after a while, two awkward teenagers clumsily experienced their first love physically. Although they were Catholics, the pressures of society, as well as raging hormones, proved to be stronger than them. Alas, their attempt to choose which commandments to keep and which not could not overturn the laws of nature. A few months after the retreat, Jill became pregnant. This time, their Catholic upbringing took over. Instead of having an abortion, they decided to become a family. Steve's dreams of going to university were shattered by just one glance from a beautiful girl. Instead, he took a job as a computer technician at an electronics store. In his free time, he took classes at a local college, hoping to earn an associate's degree in information systems. Steve accepted his new role as the family breadwinner without hesitation. He was expected to take responsibility for his actions. His dreams, ambitions, and goals took a backseat to his role as a husband and father. The music coming from the battered speakers competed with the loud rumbling of an engine that had already clocked 200,000 miles. Steve usually turned the volume up so as not to hear the sounds of a used car that needed repairs and a new muffler. However, it was decided long ago that Jill would get the best car for the convenience of the family. The old wreck served its purpose, to get from point A to point B with minimal fuel consumption. To Steve, this car was like an old t-shirt with stains of paint or bleach that, despite everything, fit perfectly. The car gave comfort. Steve knew her limits and never exceeded them. He didn't need to adjust the seat or the mirrors, everything was in its place. But the radio gods decided otherwise. On all channels, the night DJ played love songs. The only respite from them were commercial breaks, which, however, invited single people to stay home and call a dating line. The voluptuous female voice seemed to tease and torment Steve. In a rage, he hit the radio off button to get rid of this sound hell. But Steve was in the minority. In the silence of the car, his thoughts flared up with renewed vigor. Why didn't you do anything? He reproached himself. You just stood there and watched this man grope your wife. You are a coward, weakling. You could have done something, but no, you just left. Didn't even try. Steve has always avoided conflict. He was not a covert operations specialist or a U.S. Army Ranger. He wasn't exactly a champion martial artist, although he might have played one or two in video games in his youth. Steve was over 6 feet tall and weighed over 230 pounds. Much of this weight, concentrated around the waist, comes from years of fast food consumption. The word gym was not in his vocabulary. The most strenuous activity he participated in was golf, and then most often he hit the ball into the next green. Steve checked his own thoughts. You saw his hands. They are twice the size of mine. He'll probably break me in half. I'm already humiliated by the fact that he gives my wife more pleasure than I ever could. And if he also beats me up, it will only increase my humiliation. And anyway, what's the point? She is already in his arms. Do you want physical pain in addition to a broken heart? As luck would have it, Steve paid more attention to his thoughts than to the road signs, especially the red traffic light, which he drove through without even slowing down. He would never have noticed his mistake if not for the flashing red and blue lights in the rearview mirror. Frustrated, Steve hit the steering wheel with his forehead a couple of times, then fixed his gaze on the ceiling of the car, as if he could look into the heavens. Are you done? I don't know why I made you so angry, but I'm ready to recite 50 Hail Marys and 50 Our Fathers if you stop making things worse. But it only got worse. April showers were commonplace. While farmers' fields and pretentious neighbors' gardens were happy for the rain, stranded drivers with flat tires were not always, especially if the driver's phone battery is dead and there is no charger in the car. In addition, the driver, trusting the warm April weather, put on a stylish summer cotton dress. Although she managed to park the minivan on the side of a busy road, any attempt to get out and check the situation meant getting wet through. both from the downpour and from the spray of passing cars. Time has been kind to Jill. She was no longer the awkward teenager who didn't know how to accept her body. Being a late bloomer and gaining extra weight after pregnancy, Jill acquired feminine curves that made men of all ages turn to look at her. To maintain her youth, she dyed her golden hair, hiding the pesky grays that seemed to reappear as soon as she finished dyeing it. Makeup and creams were her constant companions to hide the crow's feet and smile lines that come with age. By any standard, Jill could be considered a classic MILF. Luckily for the desperate woman, one of the local patrolmen spotted her and turned around to offer help. For Officer Jim Rickman, helping ladies in need was almost a hobby with the hope of gratitude from them. There was almost no crime in this provincial town, so most of the time Jim stopped drivers for speeding. Beautiful women only had to flirt to avoid a fine. The 6-foot, 220-pound, muscular ladies' man spent most of his free time at the gym, either lifting weights or hanging around the Pilates class like a vulture. Instead of calling a tow truck, Jim changed the minivan's tire himself. He even offered to walk Jill home to make sure she got there safely. Jill, who had been brought up in the spirit of hospitality, invited the policeman into the house so that he could dry off with a towel and drink a cup of hot tea as a token of gratitude for his help. This gave Officer Rickman the opportunity to stare at Jill candidly, imagining the sounds she made during and after sex. Over tea, they reminisce about the past. Jim turned out to be Eddie Rickman's younger brother. As a teenager, Jill dreamed that Eddie would fall in love with her, take her on a romantic trip, or at least take her to Lover's Lane. However, Jim, whom she called Little Jimmy, said his older brother lost his job because the local plant was closing and moving to Mexico. Jill mentally thanked God that her prayers had gone unanswered at that time. Steve, returning home after another hard day at work, dreamed of relaxing with his family. But the need for rest disappeared as soon as he saw a police car parked in front of his house. He stopped on the street, since the entrance to the garage was blocked, and hurried into the house to make sure everything was in order. "Honey, this is little Jimmy. You remember Eddie's little brother, don't you?" said his wife. Showing his alpha male tendencies, Officer Rickman corrected Jill. "I'm not little anymore." To confirm his words, he tensed his muscles. Jim laughed loudly when he recognized Steve. Turning to Jill, he said, "Did you marry the rooster? Come on." Jill couldn't help but giggle. "Oh, I completely forgot about this nickname." Steve rolled his eyes, looked around the policeman, and turned to his wife. "Everything is fine. Weren't you hurt? Did something happen?" Jill waved it off. "Nothing serious, darling. I protected her and brought her home safe and sound. You have nothing to worry about, although maybe next time you should check the pressure in her tires. I can't believe you let her ride on bald wheels that clearly don't have enough air," the officer interjected in a condescending tone. Steve wanted to object, but Jill interrupted him. "Jimmy changed the tire on my minivan and walked me home. I invited him to tea to thank him." The officer's predatory gaze spoke for itself. It was obvious that he was imagining other ways Jill could thank him. "It's time for me to get back on patrol. If you need anything, Bill, let me know," Jim Rickman said. He looked down at Steve with contempt and added, "See you later, Rooster." Remembering the nickname that had been used to tease her for her flat chest and rural life, Jill laughed with genuine amusement. "Oh God, so many years have passed since I was called that." She straightened up to highlight her impressive breasts, proudly enjoying the look the young man gave her. "Now, I definitely can't be confused with a boy, right?" Steve finally intervened and, tensely, ushered Jim to the door. "Goodbye, Jimmy." The silence in Steve's car was heavy on his ears, adding to his sense of anxiety as he watched the policeman slowly approach his car. Steve didn't even need to look in the rearview mirror to know who was about to knock on his window. Fate had already decided to present him with the worst-case scenario. Not wanting to drag out an unpleasant meeting, Steve prepared his license and registration documents in preparation for the inevitable knock. "What's the hurry, boss?" A familiar, smug voice sounded. Steve looked at the ceiling of the car, suppressing his irritation, and handed over his license with documents. Jimmy, the hospital network is not working. I don't have time for your jokes. Officer Rickman shook his head with a disdainful expression. Rooster, this does not exempt you from following traffic rules. Do you even know why I stopped you? Because you're an asshole who enjoys his power. Steve cursed mentally, sighing heavily. No idea. For speeding, perhaps? Hey, take it easy, Rooster. You need to cool down. I'm trying to help so you don't kill someone tonight. There has already been one accident outside the city. Some prostitute was giving a guy pleasure while he was driving, and they flew off the road. Officer Rickman grinned, remembering the details of the incident, but immediately returned to the conversation. And you, by the way, flew through a red light. You know that red stops, right? Yes, whatever. Just write me a fine. I need to go to the hospital, Steve snapped. What does she even see in people like you? Yeah, six-pack abs, biceps the size of Texas, and perfect hair. Okay, tomorrow I'll start going to the gym. I'll be like this handsome fool. Well, my hair won't be the same, but I can pump up my abs. Officer Rickman shook his head again in disgust. Rooster, you're not helping yourself. I wanted to let you go with a warning, but now I've changed my mind. Of course, he would let me go if I had a deep neckline and large breasts. Steve sighed and tried to change his tone to hide his irritation. Jimmy, I'm sorry. 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm decaffeinated. I want to get to the hospital, solve the problem, and go back to bed. Well, I can understand that. If I had Jill in my bed, I'd be in a hurry too. Officer Rickman was distracted, remembering the last time he saw Jill. Okay, go to the hospital and say hi to your hot wife. The smoky smell of smoke and hickory wafted in the soft summer breeze, luring unsuspecting guests into Steve's backyard. The sounds of classic rock and roll mixed with the splashing of water, hinting at the festive atmosphere of a pool party. Every year Steve held a barbecue to celebrate the start of summer. Hot dogs, burgers, and sausages were cooked to perfection. Mashed potatoes, baked beans, and grilled corn complemented the entrees. Guests brought desserts or chips. Steve usually did the cooking himself, while the guests enjoyed cold beer and homemade wine. Jill acted as hostess, making sure no one went hungry. But today everything was different. Even though it was Sunday, Steve was called to the hospital. Jerry, the weekend tech support guy, went to St. Louis for a game instead of working on his duties. Although Steve had planned to discuss this with him on Monday, the hospital needed help now. Disappointed and irritated, he slammed the door of the house with a bang. While Steve was tinkering with a faulty access point in the Jill talked Dan into taking on the role of grill master. Even though Dan was married to Gloria, his famously wandering I fell on the bikini-clad neighbor. Jill tied a sheer sarong around her waist to show off her modesty, but that didn't stop Dan from imagining her with or without a thong. Jill spent most of the year working hard to prepare for swimsuit season. She managed to get rid of cellulite and folds on her stomach, while maintaining the volume of her breasts and the curves of her hips. Many men at the party noticed her efforts. Some women also noticed, but their glances were more envious than admiring. One of these predators was police officer Jimmy Rickman. In a joking mood, he grabbed Jill by the arms and threatened to push her into the pool. She giggled and begged for mercy, knowing that she would not be able to escape. Jill leaned back, trying to stop him. This was part of Jimmy's plan. He felt the soft curves of her body pressing against him and was sure that she felt his arousal. But he was not going to give in to the woman. Taking a strong step forward, he pushed Jill into the pool. Every man at the party dreamed of making her horny, but only Jimmy could say that he made her very excited. Unbeknownst to Jimmy and Jill, Steve returned just in time to see his wife laughing and pretending to push her half-naked body towards the policeman's athletic physique. He heard her squeal as she prepared to plunge into the cool water of the pool. He watched as her peril fell as she dived under the water. He noticed the greedy gazes of the men at the party focused on her figure as she emerged from the pool. The realization that he was married to a beautiful woman who could attract the attention of the men around him filled Steve with pride. Holding out a towel, Jill greeted her husband. Hello, dear. They say this is the best BBQ ever. She was beaming with joy, her smile stretching from ear to ear. She didn't recognize the look of concern on her husband's face. Was the party better because he wasn't there? The fluorescent lighting in the hospital waiting room made everything look sterile and unnaturally bright. This place should be cozy and comforting for those in pain, instilling hope that relief awaits them a few steps outside the office doors. However, Steve was not a patient. There was no consolation, no peace, no cure for what tormented him. All the comfort the waiting room had to offer seemed artificial and fake. Steve straightened the strap of his laptop bag and headed towards the evening receptionist. I always said that the morning starts too early. In my opinion, morning should come closer to noon, but this is too much, Steve muttered with a slight grin. He was always ready to joke or say something witty. You laugh and the world laughs with you. You cry and you cry alone. His personal life was strictly confidential and certainly not the subject of discussion in the hospital or the gossip that hovered around every corner. The red-haired girl behind the counter laughed at his joke. Well, of course you missed me while I was working the night shift. Amber, a young single mother at 22, took on the difficult task of raising her child alone after the child's father fled town after learning he was going to become a father. Working the night shift, she received a premium for her hours. Unlike other girls her age, Amber realized her responsibility and gave up the party life. After all, it was the parties that brought her to where she is now. Steve silently admired her determination. He also liked her feminine features, but he never expressed his thoughts out loud and certainly did not try to do anything about it. He could look but not touch. He's married, but not dead. However, fantasy remains fantasy. It is unreal and should not become reality. You got me, Steve said, raising his hands. If I weren't married, I would probably be on duty a lot more often. He was silent for a moment, thoughtful. Well, in a couple of months, I may not be married anymore. Then I can ask her out on a date. There was another pause as he continued his thoughts. Who needs me at her age? I'm almost twice her age. At first, Amber responded with a cheerful smile. Her eyes were glowing. But then she noticed that Steve was worried about something, and her smile turned into an expression of concern. Anyway, they're still doing the survey. I think everything will be fine. If you want, you can sit down. I'll let you know when I can visit her. His heart sank and his stomach knotted. Steve tried to hide the pain of a broken heart under a mask of bewilderment. Examination. He frowned, narrowing his eyes. I'm here to help Eric send the pictures to Nighthawk. What are you talking about? Oh, Amber was confused. Her eyes widened, as if she was backed into a corner. She wanted to escape the awkwardness, but had nowhere to go. Uncertainty, she asked. You didn't know? Steve's look forced her to continue. Your wife was in an accident. They brought her half an hour ago. Steve stood there speechless, unable to formulate a single word. However, his thoughts were racing at breakneck speed. Is this really that stupid prostitute who gives some bastard pleasure? That damn bitch never did that for me. She said it was disgusting. She said she would never do this. No, it can't be my bitch wife. Steve, the nurses will take good care of her. Everything will be okay, Amber tried to console, but her words did not sound convincing enough to hide the concern about the gossip that would surely begin in the hospital. Great, now everyone knows that my loving wife is having sex with someone else. Steve looked at Amber, studying her closely and her reaction. When she couldn't hold his gaze, he knew she knew. Looks like I won't be asking her out. After this, she probably thinks that I cannot satisfy a woman in bed. What woman in her right mind would date someone like me? Damn, how can I even show up in this hospital now? I'll be in my office, Steve said sharply, leaving the reception area without looking back. If he had looked back, he would have seen Amber wiping away her tears for him. Bright lights and shiny tinsel covered the smell of artificial pine and the dull atmosphere of plastic Christmas trees, trying to create a festive mood and hide the modest budget. But the smell of honey ham, which would be expected in such a season, was completely out of place on this holiday. The hospital, being a politically correct institution, did not want to offend Muslims who abstain from eating pork. Instead, the main course was chicken breast baked in a creamy garlic sauce and served on a bed of fettuccine. Choosing food would be an unnecessary expense. Even the entertainment for the evening turned out to be at the level of an amateur DJ who got this job only because he was someone's relative and was inexpensive. His musical repertoire was very limited, either country songs about drinking and partying or melodramatic slow ballads that brought tears. He didn't even have Christmas music to play during dinner. The lights on the dance floor alternated between different colored bulbs at the same frequency, regardless of whether it was an upbeat song or a slow dance ballad. When hospital officials and management tried to use the DJ's microphone, the speakers constantly produced reverberation and a terrible, high-pitched sound that was perhaps worse than nails scraping on a chalkboard. One of the administration employees was Steve's boss, Jonathan. Not John or Johnny. The full name, Jonathan, sounded more respectable and gave him the illusion of belonging to an old, rich family. This braggart was certainly a master of finance and had a knack for finding the gray areas in GOP standards to keep the hospital afloat. However, his real element was politics and the ability to arrange events in his favor. At these events, he always emphasized that spending on employees was a powerful boost to employee morale and that every penny spent was worth it. However, the very next day Jonathan scrupulously checked all the receipts and found fault with every expense. This CFO was aging like a cheap $5 wine. His hair was mostly white, with occasional streaks of black. His skin was bronzed from countless hours spent on the golf course and social events at the country club. Unfortunately, the same could not be said about his wife. She was diagnosed with terminal cancer and her days were numbered. Of course, Jonathan did his best to portray a caring husband and demanded the highest quality care from the hospital staff when his wife came for an X-ray. But on such evenings his true character was revealed. Anything that wore a dress and had an attractive shape became his target. In this provincial area, the Christmas event resembled an adult version of a school prom. Women were allowed to take half a day off to get their hair done. The perfect evening dress required traveling to shopping centers hundreds of miles away to ensure no one else ended up wearing the same outfit. Jill was no different from other women. For the housewife and mother of 2 children, this holiday was the only evening of the year when she could dress up and talk with peers and not with children and their friends. She always tried to look perfect for the sake of her husband because her appearance reflected his status. The perfect curls, just the right shine of her little black dress, and perfect posture provided by her high heels created the image of a devoted and supportive wife. But she was tormented by the extra pounds. Walking, drinking water, and home video workouts did not help get rid of excess weight on the waist and hips. In October, Jill realized that the holidays were just around the corner, and so was swimsuit season. Deciding that it was time for her to take action, she joined the gym and began working out in a strength training group. If overweight people on reality TV could lose weight, then she can do it too. Jill tried to persuade Steve to join her so that they could lose weight together, but Steve always found excuses, either work, family, or housework. Disappointed, Jill accepted his refusal, but did not allow herself to shy away. After 3 months, Jill had lost noticeable weight. As a reward for her success, she bought a new evening dress, since the old one, time-tested, no longer fit. She dropped a couple sizes. Jill decided to reward herself with anything but food. Now, in the midst of the holidays, she was not going to give in to temptation. Her tight dress emphasized the soft curve of her breasts and smooth lines of her figure. The deep V neckline discreetly showed off her cleavage, while a delicate necklace drew attention to the hidden valley. Jonathan walked around each desk, greeting the directors and their spouses in a businesslike manner before hastily leaving. The lack of Christmas bonuses was causing dissatisfaction among employees, but a successful balance sheet promised a generous bonus for the chief financial officer himself. However, his plans changed as soon as he saw Steve's wife. The DJ changed the tempo of the music to a slow love song. It was one of Jill's favorite songs, and she was about to get up to drag her husband to the dance floor. Steve didn't mind, but then Jonathan asked her to dance. Steve wanted to refuse, but it was his boss. She and Jill exchanged helpless glances. To avoid creating a scandal or social fiasco, Jill accepted Jonathan's invitation. Jonathan was taller than Jill and used this advantage to sneak peeks into her cleavage while the slow song played. His hands slowly moved down, stopping on her buttocks, and he pressed his body against hers. Such brazen behavior in front of all the guests stunned Jill, paralyzing her. Her voice did not protest against his touch. Her hands did not increase the distance between their bodies. Her wide eyes tried to convey that she was extremely embarrassed, but Jonathan was indifferent to her feelings, only his own. Luckily, Steve recognized his wife's silent cry for help. He gallantly patted Jonathan on the shoulder and said, "May I intervene, Jonathan? It seems one of the council members is looking for you at the bar. You have a charming wife, Steve." "I wish you a pleasant evening," Jonathan replied politely, but it was noticeable that he was in a hurry to leave to shake hands with the council members. Although Steve reacted quickly and saved his wife, the damage was done. The next day, rumors and exaggerated stories began to spread around the hospital about how the chief financial officer was harassing Steve's wife, and she did not resist him. The darkness that shrouded Steve's temporary shelter hid him from the world. Stacks of paper arranged in a crisscross pattern reminded him of projects with looming deadlines, indifferent to his personal life. The life he had built within these four walls teetered on the edge of the world collapsing around him. Only the soft glow of his laptop illuminated his small world, keeping his attention on the task at hand. The hospital needed a solution to a technical problem, and the emergency room doctor was looking to Steve to help provide quality care to his patients. Only now the patient in urgent need of help turned out to be a cheater. She deserves to suffer. She must endure pain that will be much greater than what she is causing me now. Each thought grew stronger, more filled with hatred. Steve turned away from the screen with contempt. A grin appeared on his face, and then he abruptly jumped out of his chair, splashing out his emotions and anger. The sudden movement caused the chair to tip over with a crash. Some papers from his carefully organized desk ended up on the floor next to him. Not realizing that his abrupt actions would cause such a mess, Steve kicked his chair in frustration and then bent down to pick up the scattered papers, letters, and printouts. It was at that moment, with a new perspective, that Steve realized that his office was like a companion to his memories. His home may have been destroyed, but family photographs were strategically placed in his workplace. Fate may have positioned the photo of him playing catch with his two sons so that it reflects the light from the laptop at the most appropriate angle. Or some cosmic force so great and powerful had placed the photograph from Jill's 40th birthday at such an angle that his children's love for their mother would not go unnoticed. Or maybe the hand of God touched all of this to quietly whisper the instruction to a lost soul: they need their mother. Closing his eyes with doom, Steve quickly collected his papers and sat down at his laptop again. However, before he could press another key or enter another command, the door to his office swung open. "Hey, buddy, are you okay?" "I heard a crash," Eric asked with a hint of concern. Steve sighed heavily and, continuing to type on the keyboard, replied, "Yes, I'm fine. Just a little annoyed and tired." Eric shook his head, looking puzzled. "What are you doing here?" "I fixed the problem, as you said on the phone. The pictures are already being transferred. It was pretty brilliant." Now it was Steve's turn to feel puzzled. "Already? Have you reconfigured your firewall and router?" Without waiting for an answer, Steve entered a command to check the settings. "Already. Everything works, buddy. So go upstairs and see your wife." Eric paused for a second. During that moment, Steve felt that he was struggling with something inside himself. Steve's questioning look prompted Eric to continue. "But if it were my wife, I would have scorched the ground where she stood if she had done that to me." Steve rolled his eyes and plunged back into his gloomy melancholy. "Yes, I need to make a couple of calls. Surely the boys will want to know about their mother's condition." I wonder how the bastard who ruined my life is doing. I hope she bit his dignity off in the accident. That would be poetic justice. Please, Lord, if you're listening, just say this prayer once. I beg you. Hey, Eric, any news about the other passenger from the accident? Steve tried his best to hide his hatred, but it was useless. Eric shrugged helplessly. I think not. It looks like he was wearing a seat belt. Steve rolled his eyes and looked at the ceiling. You don't really like me, do you? I don't know what I did, but whatever it was, forgive me. With a heavy exhalation, he said to Eric, well, go home and rest. I need to make a couple of calls. I probably won't be there because of all this mess. Eric closed the door behind him, giving Steve the privacy he needed to make his calls. He called his sons, then her parents, and then his sister. Having overcome the emotional storm, Steve continued to pretend that he did not know the details of the accident. He left the joy of explaining their family's injuries to his wife. I wish I was a fly on the wall during this conversation. It's a pity I won't be there. Last number left. When the person on the other end answered, Steve said, Hey, sorry to wake you up, but I really need a friend right now. He thought he could hold it in. He was wrong. Taking a deep breath, he continued, Would you like to have some coffee? I'll treat you. Tall trees flanked the sports car as the happy couple drove down the winding road on a dark summer night. This evening was ideal for a secret meeting. There was no one else on the road. The radio seemed to bless their midnight rendezvous, filling the airwaves with love songs. The couple laughed at the irony of late-night commercials that claimed hot women were staying at home and talking on the phone instead of going out and socializing. The calm of the night took away the stress and fatigue from the daily routine. There were no bills to pay. There were no chores to do. All that mattered was that they were together. The deserted country road filled them with nostalgia, allowing them to mentally return to their youth, as if they were teenagers again. The couple's age did not affect their plans in any way. Tall trees were not the only phallic symbol along this winding path. The powerfully built man unbuttoned his jeans and gave the woman in the passenger seat a meaningful look. His confidence was almost palpable, and it brought a small smile to her face. She looked away in embarrassment, feeling a tense silence settle between them. We're going too fast, she said, trying to diffuse the situation. The man removed his hand from the steering wheel to relax a little, and then, changing his position a little, sat more comfortably. Their gazes met again, and at that moment it seemed that words were no longer needed. I don't even do this to my husband. And I'm not your husband, the man answered with a smug grin. The soft ring of the office phone brought the depressed man back to reality. Usually the phone was a real punishment for him at work. Constant calls about the computer not working, or the system is slow, or any other complaint related to user error irritated his department. Usually the sound of the phone would cause sighs and grins, but now the sound that interrupted his thoughts and wild fantasies became a welcome relief for him. The fact that the phone's display showed the PBX number temporarily calmed him down. Information technology, this is Steve. How can I help? Came the programmed answer from the director of the IT department. Hi, Amber greeted him. Her voice sounded quiet and thoughtful. How are you? Are you okay? Do you think like me? My wife is cheating on me, and you think I'll be okay. Mentally, he screamed, throwing out his rage at the first interlocutor he came across. However, Steve was smart enough to restrain himself. Oh, I can handle it. It's just. He paused, trying to keep his emotions from coming out, but failing. It hurts, but I will survive. He fell silent again, trying to regain at least a semblance of composure, and finally asked, How can I help you, madam? Steve. Amber wanted to say so much more, but she couldn't find words that didn't sound like a quote from a postcard bought in a gift shop. Her heart sank with sympathy. The doctor wants to talk to you about your wife. What? Does he need her number so he can call her when she comes to her senses to thank him properly? Cynicism again, but the filter did not allow these thoughts to break through. Oh, great, he replied, mentally imagining the doctor. Yes, Steve, Your wife has a laryngeal inflammation caused by the fact that her throat was filled with a huge penis at the time of the accident. She'll never be able to speak again. He debated whether to write this down as a plus or a minus because she wouldn't be able to nag him anymore. I'll be there soon. In the early morning hours in the emergency room, life revolved around two tasks: patient care and record keeping. A small staff of nurses simultaneously met the needs of patients and tried to help the only doctor on shift. Entering data, compiling nursing notes, obtaining test results, and X-rays were all routine tasks. However, when Steve showed up on the ward, the nurses suddenly forgot about their duties, such as checking and replenishing supplies. Only the doctor turned to him. "We have stabilized your wife's condition and are preparing her for transport to St. Mary's Medical Center," the Indian doctor explained. 20 years of marriage, love, and devotion were difficult to turn off, despite the pain of the offended husband. His instincts made him ask, "By helicopter? What's happened? Is she okay?" He looked behind the doctor towards the curtained room, expecting to see his wife. But his gaze caught movement in one of the corridors. The night guard walked slowly towards the emergency department, clearly intending to observe the conversation between the doctor and the furious husband. The doctor continued in his heavily accented English. "She has swelling in the spinal cord area, affecting her motor functions. Fortunately, sensation in the limbs is preserved. She breathes on her own. She is now being given methylprednisolone and is being sent to St. Mary's Medical Center for surgery to relieve swelling and relieve compression on the spinal cord." "You've got to be kidding me." Steve looked at the ceiling with irritation and annoyance. "Do you hate me? Do you think I look like Job?" After he released his anger to the heavens, Steve looked the doctor straight in the eyes and asked a question. "Will she be able to walk again?" "We will know more after the operation. It is very reassuring that she is showing signs of tenderness in her toes," the doctor responded. Steve noticed that there was someone in the other observation room. The drawn curtain concealed the patient's identity and protected his privacy, but a glance at the guard stopped Steve from doing something reckless and stupid. A deceitful smile accompanied his answer to the doctor. "Thank you, doctor." The lonely back hallway of the emergency department, which was usually used for transporting patients, for example, to the operating room or for X-rays or for transfers from the ER to the inpatient unit, became Steve's sanctuary. Hospital staff called this corridor the Turnpike because of its length. The silence and length gave Steve time to concentrate on his thoughts. With every step, he became more aware that his life was reminiscent of the crisis that had occurred in the hospital just an hour ago. The central switchboard had failed, causing chaos and disorder. Jill was his central switchboard. Steve found solace in the safety and privacy of the Network Operations Center, his technological lair worthy of a comic book anti-hero. Hidden in a secret closet with a web of network cables and twisted pairs used for telephone wiring, Steve found his sanctuary. The flickering green, blue, orange, and red LEDs on the networking equipment calmed him, like the lights of a Christmas tree in a dark living room. Steve connected his laptop to the radiology network and opened the PACS software. "Screw HIPAA. I'm just verifying the integrity of patient data after possible data loss." He convinced himself with a sense of duty. "If my wife is being stabilized after a spinal injury, then you should have gotten a CT scan yourself, bastard. Let's find out who you really are." The violation of government regulations barely touched his mind as different windows appeared on the laptop screen. Steve opened the patient's demographics first, where he saw Don Juan's real name, address, phone number, and place of work. He couldn't resist his technological passion and flipped through the CT scans. Even though he didn't know what he was seeing, looking at the insides of the man who had ruined his life gave Steve a faint sense of satisfaction. It humanized his villain a bit. Finally, he read the preliminary radiological report. He had a mild concussion and was kept in the hospital overnight. Despite the pain and suffering that lingered in the back of his mind, Steve skillfully blocked out his feelings. In his refuge, far from the real world, he pushed the images of adultery into the background. Now his task was to obtain information about his wife's lover, a task similar to his work audit duties. In his thoughts, everything regained its usual order. The sudden ringing of the phone pulled Steve out of his thoughts. A quick glance at the display made him grin faintly. "Are you following me with GPS? How did you know I was here?" Amber's voice and words touched him. "I know you, Steve." There was a short pause, after which she continued. "Besides, your car is still in the parking lot. I see it on the security camera. And since you don't answer in the office, and you're not in the department, I decided that you were here." "Touché, young lady," Steve replied. The mention of separation brought images of his unfaithful wife back to the center of his mind. His voice wavered as he asked, "Anyway, what happened?" Amber visibly hesitated, but then still said, "Gloria is waiting for you here. She said you called her. Should I tell her about?" Steve immediately interrupted her. "No, I myself." "Thank you for saying that. Can you take her to the cafeteria? I need to pack my things here, and I'll be right over." Gloria was married to Walking Eyes Dan and was their friend and neighbor. In the mornings, Jill and Gloria often drank coffee together and discussed TV series. Since Gloria and Dan had no children, they often invited Steve and Jill to dinner. Steve hated Dan's selfish and materialistic nature, but Gloria was quite charming, despite the fact that she looked like a model from a glossy magazine. Behind the store-bought California blonde locks and silicone breasts, Steve saw the kindness of her heart. She made all the changes for the sake of love and devotion to her husband. Of course, she has to compete with young secretaries who are hunters of wealth. This idiot is so busy sniffing around other women that he does not see who is under his nose. For him, she is just another trophy. What a fool he is, Steve thought. Despite the early hour, around 4 in the morning, Gloria looked as if she had just left a beauty salon. In the dimness of the hospital cafeteria, Steve noticed that her long hair was perfectly straight, without a single dark root. The makeup was unobtrusive, but emphasized high cheekbones. Her modest but figure-hugging clothes made her doll-like figure stand out. "Steve, you sounded so upset on the phone. Are you okay? What's happened?" Gloria bombarded him with questions until she suddenly came to a conclusion, but then continued her interrogation. "Jill said you've been at the conference all week. What are you doing at home? Did something happen to the boys or Jill?" While she was talking, Steve poured himself a cup of coffee and added so much cream and sugar that the drink could have been called creamer with a dash of coffee. After waiting for her to finish, he exhaled slowly, as if clearing himself, and answered in a hushed voice. "Jill had an accident about an hour or an hour and a half ago. She appears to have spinal cord swelling. She is sent for surgery to St. Mary's Medical Center." Gloria gasped, pressing her hand to her chest. Like any man, Steve couldn't help but let his eyes wander to her impressive cleavage, especially when she drew attention to her breasts with such a simple gesture. With an effort, he averted his eyes and continued. "There seems to be concern about paralysis, but the doctor mentioned something about feeling in the toes." Although he did not give a definite answer, "I guess we'll know more after the surgery." "What was she doing so late at night? Were the boys with her?" Gloria asked, finding a chair and sitting down, struck by her friend's tragedy. Steve shook his head. "No, they are in college. Jake decided to stay there for the summer to earn extra money before the school year started. But Justin moved a long time ago. He was already in his 3rd year and decided that he was ready to become an adult. When he talked about his sons, he was overcome with a feeling of pride. I called them to tell them that their mother had been in an accident. So what happened? You know, did she tell you something?" Steve took a long sip of his coffee, trying to control his thoughts. He savored the taste, trying to calm himself before answering. "I don't know exactly what happened. I haven't seen the police report on the accident yet, although Jimmy promised to find out for me. And everyone in the was busy stabilizing her, so I couldn't get to her." Gloria squinted, catching something unsaid in his answer. "Steve, what's going on? Is something wrong? You're clearly not telling me everything." The emotions accumulated in his soul forced Steve to jump out of his chair and begin to nervously walk back and forth. Did she talk to you? Not today, but over the last month or so. He spread his hands in a helpless gesture. About anything. About me. About the fact that I work too much, or the fact that I don't go to the gym with her. He sighed, begging her to share at least something he could understand. Anything. Yes, just the usual grumbling at her husband, which happens to any wife. Surely you and your friends have the same thing, discussing what bitches we are and how we are just nagging you, nagging and nagging you. Gloria answered with a note of uncertainty and confusion in her voice. Steve continued to pace in circles, as if trying to find answers or solve a mystery. What about other men? She often went to the gym. I mean, she looks great. Was she talking about the men who go there? Well, I mentioned a couple of guys, but it's all nonsense. Material for Bob. I don't think there was anything serious there. You know how men fantasize about some actresses in microscopic bikinis from cheap movies, the neighbor explained, although there was something more in her voice than she was trying to show. Material for Bob? What the hell? Steve exploded, unable to contain his rage at his wife's alleged infidelity. An unexpected flash made Gloria recoil. Defensively, she said. Bob is the battery guy. Well, her sex toy. Steve, don't get so worked up. It's just a toy. There's nothing to worry about. She loves you. Nonsense. His voice sounded too loud for the empty dining room. Steve took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. With a cold look, he blurted out. Nonsense, Gloria. When a man fantasizes about a movie star, the chance of him meeting her and getting her into bed is about 1 in a million. This will never happen. He exhaled, pursing his lips. His eyes glared at his neighbor as if trying to see her thoughts. And when you fantasize about your neighbor or the man from the gym you see every day, the likelihood that something will happen increases significantly. Gloria couldn't help but chuckle. She tried to be sympathetic to his outburst, explaining, Steve, I saw the way you look at me, or rather at my chest. It doesn't bother me. After all, it was bought and should be valued. She tried to smile to lighten the situation. So you can't tell me you don't fantasize about me or any of the nurses who work here. I bet you have a couple of dirty scenes in your mind. Steve's shoulders sagged with disappointment. Okay, yes, I sometimes fantasize. But you know what? Fantasy and reality are different things. I never bring fantasies into the real world. Fantasies are just fantasies, something made up that will never actually happen. Gloria touched his forearm and squeezed it gently, trying to calm him down. Jill would never do something like that, Steve. This is just women's talk. She smiled again, hoping to ease the tension. You don't trust her. Steve retreated like a sailor, avoiding the call of a deadly siren. No more. It was painful to admit it out loud. When the words were spoken, they became reality. The dam collapsed. Steve's eyes filled with tears, and he collapsed into his chair. Crushed, he said, I caught them. I saw them in my bed. The discovery left Gloria speechless. Barely audible, she asked, Who did you catch? What can you tell me about Christopher Whitman? His question sounded like a detective interrogating a criminal suspect. Steve watched Gloria closely, looking for signs of deception or recognition. Her eyes widened in shock when he mentioned the name. She shook her head carefully and pretended that she didn't know who she was talking about. I don't know who it is, Steve. Is he your friend? He tilted his head, making it clear that he didn't believe her. Tapping his tongue, he answered defiantly. Christopher Whitman works for your husband's transport company. Should I go ask him who he is? Resigned to the inevitable, Gloria lowered her eyes and admitted. Okay, Chris was a forklift operator at one of my husband's warehouses. When the economy slowed down and Dan had to downsize his fleet, that meant fewer hours in the warehouse. Without trucks, there was nothing to unload, and forklift operators were no longer needed. Since Dan and Chris were close, he offered him a job at our house as a handyman. Gloria's cheeks flushed brightly as she continued her story. Jill came the day after you left for the conference and caught us playing pranks. She swallowed and subconsciously licked her lips, imagining that moment. I was sunbathing in the backyard when Chris suddenly acted inappropriately. At that moment, Jill came in, noticed the situation, became embarrassed, and, apologizing, quickly went home. From then on, she always called ahead to see if she could come, and tried to avoid meeting Chris if he showed up in the room. Gloria crossed her arms over her chest, as if pronouncing a childish oath, and begged, "I swear to you, Steve, it's true." And she never asked about him or talked about him when you were drinking coffee, Steve asked curiously. Several moments passed before Gloria replied. She asked about him. For example, is he a good kisser? Or how does he compare to your husband? But that's just girl talk. We called him my boy toy or slave. In a cold tone that betrayed his feelings about his wife's infidelity, Steve asked, "So he's a good kisser. Is he better than your husband?" Gloria's silence was his answer. He stood up, and she lowered her gaze, unable to look at him. "She'll need a friend when she wakes up down there. You better be there when it happens. Won't you be next to her? She will need you more than anything," Gloria asked, pleading. Steve just shook his head and answered sharply. "Obviously, I didn't give her what she needed." Gloria crossed the room, trying to close the distance between them. "Steve, don't think like that. She loves you. This incident with Chris is a mistake. She knows it. You can forgive her and get over it, right? Please don't let this ruin your 20 years together." Steve stopped at the exit, turned to Gloria, and said with anger and rage that burned his heart, "They're taking her for spinal surgery because she gave that Chris pleasure that she never gave me, and he couldn't keep the car on the road. If this is love, then she has a strange idea about it." He added sarcastically, "Do you want me to forgive her so that I can survive this?" Gloria recoiled from his rage, giving Steve the opportunity to leave the cafeteria. In desperation, she shouted after him, "But she will need someone to take care of her." The only answer was the sound of the door closing behind him. In the silence of the dimly lit cafeteria, Gloria added quietly, "Chris is not the person who can do this. The monster that haunted his nightmares has changed again. From an affair in the bedroom to the supposed events in the car, Steve's creative imagination captured what happened and twisted it into a darker version. So vivid and clear images were now colored by his uncertainty and doubts. The more he learned, the worse the nightmare became. Fragments of truth fed his imagination, as if giving weight to the dark possibilities he imagined in his mind. The nightmare consumed him, seizing him like a black ooze that suffocated his heart, but forced him to endure even more terrible visions. Laughter from the distant past seemed to be ingrained into the wood that made up the backyard. If you listened closely, fun and laughter could still be caught in the wind. However, now the joy gave way to ridicule and humiliation. The summer breeze cooled the air, as if demonstrating coldness towards its goal. The wooden porch served its purpose well, providing a place for fun. In its open spaces, there were 4 naked bodies. 2 men sat on sun loungers, chatting with each other in a relaxed manner. Next to them were Dan and Chris, who watched what was happening with interest. Jill stood in front of them, her toned body, the result of long workouts in the gym, attracted attention. She was dressed in a light beach outfit that emphasized her figure. Gloria stood behind her, carefully straightening Jill's long brown hair and whispering something in her ear. A slight smile played on Jill's lips when Gloria, with a slight gesture, helped her feel more confident in front of men. "You look amazing," Gloria said softly, pushing Jill forward a little so she could get her attention. "All eyes are only on you." Jill felt a slight warmth, embarrassment mixed with satisfaction from the admiration that she noticed in the looks of others. "No," Steve felt pressure on his shoulder and abruptly pulled out of his seat, trying to free himself from the dark mucus that was holding him down in order to save his wife from the temptations of his neighbors. Unfortunately, he ended up in his office. He was woken up by a young call center employee. She withdrew her hand with a worried look. Steve's tear-stained face did not go unnoticed, and her face darkened. "Amber, I'm sorry. Looks like I dozed off," Steve said, trying to tidy up his clothes. Her voice was soft and careful. Steve, you should probably go. You'll want to be there when your wife wakes up from surgery. He rolled his eyes, turning away from yet another woman who was trying to force him to be around a cheater. I won't go. I called the guys. They'll be there when she wakes up, Steve said with obvious anger, unable to contain his bitterness. The gloomy expression on Amber's face made him stop. He stared at her, trying to read her body language. He didn't have to wait long before she said sadly, Steve, I know you're suffering right now. I went through this myself. But this is not the Steve I know. You love your wife. You always talk about her, about your vacations together, about going to the movies. She pointed to the portrait on the table, which was larger than all the other photographs. You still have her photo on your desktop. Yeah, well, she decided she wanted someone else to take her on these dates, Steve grumbled. Amber continued to speak directly, but with concern. You need to fight for her, Steve. But before she could finish, Steve exploded. He almost pointed his finger in her face. Do I need to fight for her? How about she fight for me? She had to fight for our relationship, for our marriage, for our love. She should have stood up to this fucking bastard who doesn't care about our marriage. But no, she spread her legs for him without even thinking about saying no. Damn, I was the last thing on her mind when she had sex with that bastard. Folding her arms across her chest, Amber gave him a level look and said, And you just let that bastard steal it without even trying to fight. The rooster protects the chickens in the coop from weasels, Steve. The rooster doesn't give up when the weasel sneaks inside. He fights until the very end. Fight for her. Show her that she made a stupid mistake and almost lost everything. Steve narrowed his eyes, a mixture of pain from his wife's betrayal and the memory of Amber's nickname from school. His silence dragged on. Amber's voice became softer. She came closer, put her hand on his shoulder, and began to slowly massage his back. Steve, swallow your pride and be there for your wife. She felt the tension run down his spine and quickly added, I'm not saying you should let this guy walk all over you. No, I'm saying you need to show your wife that you love her in good times and bad. She will see what kind of person you really are. You're not going to punish her for one mistake after 20 years of marriage, are you? How can I know that this was the only mistake? Steve asked, his head drooping. What if she cheated on me all these years and I was just blind? What if she's sleeping with a bunch of different men and I haven't noticed? You should ask her about this. Ask a direct question and find out the truth. Perhaps there is more behind her actions than you know, explained Amber, who is raising a child alone after her baby's father ran away. Steve looked down at the floor, his head bowed in shame. What if I don't want to know the answer to this question? You need to close this, Steve. Even if things don't work out between you and your wife, you need to understand where things went wrong. This way you can prevent this situation from happening again when you find someone new. She added with a smile, and you will find it. And she continued, but right now she needs her husband's support to get through this difficult moment. She will rely on your strength, Steve. Trust me, she knows she failed you. I'm sure she will do everything to correct her mistake. Call it remorse or guilt, it doesn't matter. When she sees that you are there, taking care of her and supporting her in difficult times, she will forget about whatever his name is. Amber winked, trying to diffuse the situation. Besides, the Steve I know would always help me in difficult times. But how can I forget? How can I see her as a loving wife when all I see is a traitor who spread her legs for some scumbag? Amber shook her head, not knowing the answer to these questions. I'm not saying that it will be easy. All you can do is try. You have the support of your friends. She whispered under her breath. Even if one of them is made of plastic, I want to take a fork and puncture those stupid balls. Steve smiled at her joke, detecting a hint of jealousy in it. Okay, Amber, I'll talk to her and be there for her, but I don't promise anything. She hurt me to the core. This is not something you can just forgive and forget. Nobody is asking you to do this, Steve. If someone thinks that way, they just don't understand how much it hurts you, Amber replied. She paused, remembering the conversation with her ex, and then added, "It's not just sex. This is something intimate, personal, secret. This is a connection between people. Yes, for some it's just lust, but—" She shrugged, making it clear that this aspect of the issue was not so important to her. Steve hugged her and said, "Thank you, Amber. I'll call you and let you know how she is." The roar of the helicopter drowned out the sound of the stereo in Steve's car. The tremor from its blades was felt even inside the car, recalling the difficult situation in which he found himself. Steve waited until the helicopter was out of sight before he took off. His gaze followed the car that was carrying away the remains of 20 years of his life. The dark skies of the night began to lighten into the colors of dawn as Steve turned onto the highway. Once on the road, he turned off the radio and became lost in his thoughts. He needed to get himself together and prepare for what awaited him at St. Mary's Medical Center. Amber's right. I really need to close this page. I need to understand why she betrayed me after 20 years. But damn it, I'm not going to be soft on that bitch. Once on the side, it's hard to survive, but we could cope. Once in our marital bed, it would take a damn miracle for me to forgive that, but miracles happen sometimes. But what about a long affair that included various caresses that she always refused to give me? No way, let that bitch go to hell. A gentle turn in the road distracted Steve from his thoughts. But who will take care of her? If she remains paralyzed after this accident, who will be there for her? She is, after all, the mother of your children. The boys will need support too. You can't just burn everything to the ground along with her remains. Steve, remember when you left the electronics store 15 years ago to find a better job? You ruined your family's life by moving, and why did you return home 5 years later, forcing them to adapt to change again? Supported you. Yes, she caused a scandal several times, but she stayed with you. She didn't fully understand you, but she was there. Feeling a gust of wind from a passing truck, Steve answered himself. Yes, but the move was for the sake of a better life for my family. It's not because I was chasing a skirt or did it simply because of my desires. I did it for the money. I didn't cheat on my wife. Of course, there were opportunities all around the young nurses, but I didn't. I remembered my vows. Okay, I may not have been the best husband at that time. I was probably more married to my job than to my wife. Did it for the sake of the family. The boys needed braces or new equipment for their sports. She herself demanded new dresses or a bigger house. I could not provide all this on a fixed salary with an associate's degree. Moving to a new job gave me not only a promotion, but also a new outlook on life. And she left me for some forklift operator. How is this guy going to give her a better life? Okay, he may be twice my size, all muscle, and apparently the size of a damn stallion. But what does that matter? Meaning, there are more important things in life than what happens in bed. Will he be there for her now that she can't walk? Or better yet, will he be there for her when she doesn't feel anything below the waist? Will this bastard move on to the next one? The skirt she finds, because for him she is now dead. Well, she made her choice, so now let her reap the benefits. She will need a miracle of the level of the parting of the Red Sea to convince me otherwise. The theme from his favorite time travel movie from the 80s interrupted his thoughts. His smartphone lit up, indicating an incoming call. The caller ID did not have a photo attached, which meant it was not one of his contacts. Hello? Hello, Cockerel. Steve rolled his eyes and replied with irritation in his voice. What do you want, Jimmy? I'm a little busy. Laughter came from the other end of the line until Jimmy was able to compose himself. Yeah, I just wanted to know if I could be next. I hear your wife is a great pleasure. Jimmy and the chorus of male laughter on the other end didn't even notice that Steve had hung up. Pressing his lips together, he said decisively, "Fuck you, bastard." Between his thoughts and humiliation, Steve gathered all his will into a fist, isolating himself from the pain of a broken heart. There was a determined glint in his eyes as he turned off the highway. The medical center was no longer his goal. His little car creaked in protest at the sudden change in direction and speed, but Steve didn't care anymore. His patience was exhausted, and he pushed the car to its limit. With phone in hand, he called Eric. Without formalities, he asked the question in a harsh tone. "Eric, do you still have those tools from the cybersecurity competition?" Eric's voice sounded with a tinge of suspicion, but one could not help but notice the hidden delight. "Of course, but why? Or is it better for me not to know?" "It's better not to know. Can you have them ready for me in 10 to 15 minutes? Steve paused as ideas continued to form in his head. "Oh yes, we didn't talk. This call is just to say that I won't be here today and that you'll have to rebuild the central switchboard." Eric did not hide his joy. "Got it, boss. The flash drive will be waiting for you in your mailbox. Just don't do anything I would do." On the way back to their hometown, the sun rose over the horizon, illuminating the countryside. The golden morning sparkled like a heavenly beacon, showing him the way. All worries and problems remained when he turned around. All that mattered now was the next action. He quickly got to the place where he was able to get the necessary tools for his plan. Flash drive in hand, Steve entered Christopher Whitman's address into the GPS on his smartphone. The program's voice reminded him of one of his favorite science fiction series, which made him smile. Forward, he thought as he steered the car towards a new target. Although Steve tried to remain stoic as he drove where the computer voice pointed, the ruins of the trailer park brought back painful images. She'd rather sleep with some guy who can barely afford to live in an aluminum box than be with me. Hell, his damn Mustang is probably worth more than this entire fleet. He tilted his head to the side and grinned wryly. This idiot was probably too greedy to pay for full insurance. His driving skills clearly spelled the end of his muscle car. When the voice announced that he was approaching his destination, the smartphone highlighted the presence of Wi-Fi networks in the area. Neither network was protected by a padlock symbol, meaning there was no encryption. Steve shook his head as he parked next to an abandoned trailer. He looked at the ceiling of the car, thinking, "Thank you, stupid people." He then reached into the back seat for his laptop and quickly plugged in the flash drive Eric had left for him. Windows flashed across the screen as he began manipulating various tools and internet addresses. His eyes darted over the words, completely focused on the task at hand. The indifference and apathy of the inhabitants of the trailer park allowed them not to notice either the damaged car or the fact that the driver did not go outside. Steve felt quiet gratitude again. "You really made up for me last night." As he pressed enter to execute the last command on the computer, Steve slammed his fist into the ceiling several times. "Ha! I never thought I would be so happy about budget cuts in our city." Steve fought furiously through the new screens belonging to the police information system. They really should have invested in a smart CIO. Oh well, their stinginess is to my benefit. A few keystrokes brought another grin to Steve's face. What was Rickman thinking when he appointed this? Didn't he know that the car should have just been sent to the impound lot and not destroyed at the junkyard at 9 a.m. this morning? Steve, imitating the Spanish accent, shook his finger at the screen. "Jimmy, you have something to explain." He clasped his fingers, extended his arms forward, and the sound of cracking knuckles echoed throughout the interior of the car. Satisfied with his progress, Steve muttered. Next, Steve pulled out a piece of paper from his laptop bag that had Christopher Whitman's entire personal and demographic profile written down. Of course, an address was necessary for the first part of this trip, but even more important information was required to complete the task. "Come here, little thing, little thing, little thing," Steve chuckled in thought. He did not hesitate to enter Christopher Whitman's social number and other financial information into known phishing sites. "There's just one thing left," Steve muttered, opening a new web page. Company website, Heartland Trucking, advertised a small fleet of trucks owned by Daniel Hart, Steve's neighbor and Gloria's husband. Let's see if he hosts the site himself or rents hosting. If he does it himself, Broken Heartland Trucking is guaranteed for him. To his surprise, the company's web page was indeed located on the perimeter of their network. Using a few well-placed programs and exploiting open ports on the company firewall, Steve penetrated the system. Financial and personnel records were just the beginning. His true goal was logistics software. Deleting records or changing cargo destinations were just examples of the chaos Steve planned to unleash on the people who ruined his life. When Steve looked up from the screen, the morning sun was already high. He arched, stretched his neck, and rolled his head to relieve the tension caused by the awkward position. Physiotherapists are always talking about ergonomics. Now it's clear why. He rubbed his neck and looked around the trailer park. Get used to your new home, trailer girl of easy virtue. After refueling at the station, Steve set out on the hour-long highway drive to St. Mary's Medical Center. After his ritual of digital revenge, Steve found peace of mind. The question of why the love of his life betrayed him no longer tormented his heart. He cried no more, burying the last events of the week under the rubble of the ones and zeros with which he had destroyed the lives of those who had destroyed him. The tinted glass, waterfall in the lobby, and other architectural elements indicated wealth and luxury, the exact opposite of the hospital in his small hometown. The use of technology in visitor kiosks was just one example of the modern conveniences of a large institution. Steve couldn't hide his envy as he made his way to the room where his wife was recovering from surgery. I wonder what the bill for this treatment will be, thought Steve. His internal monologue was interrupted again. This time a nasty, harsh voice with notes of hatred and contempt said, "My sister has been here for more than 8 hours, and you only deign to appear now? What kind of husband are you after this? I'm glad she's divorcing you." Steve raised an eyebrow at the unexpected revelation. "Mary, my beloved relative." He rolled his eyes, and as he passed by, deliberately brushed his shoulder against his sister-in-law. Neither the pain, nor the drama, nor the experiences that Steve endured prepared him for what he saw on the threshold of the hospital room. Jill's weakened body looked sick and fragile. Her pale face was lost against the background of a light blue hospital gown, and Roman 4 was inserted into a vein in her arm, reminiscent of the mess of wires in Steve's network closet. Jill was rebooted. All emotions came flooding in at once. Memories of their first date, wedding day, and honeymoon came crashing down on him. Birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays came to mind, leaving him breathless. But his heart sank when Jill turned away as soon as he entered. She didn't want to see him. In a soft voice, Jill said, "Don't look at me, Steve. I don't want you to see me like this." Every word she said was saturated with pain and suffering. Tears flowed down her pale cheeks. Steve wanted to wipe away those tears, to hug his beloved wife, to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay. However, his feet felt rooted to the floor because of what happened last night. The contradiction was again torn within him. Steve opened his mouth, trying to find words. He was so sure that he was going to give his wife a verbal beating for her betrayal, but the picture before his eyes deprived him of his resolve. He cared for this woman for 20 years. His heart did not allow him to unleash his anger on her. "Just leave her alone, Steve," came an annoying voice from behind. Mary walked past Steve to take her place at Jill's bedside. "She doesn't need you anymore." Steve ignored Mary and looked at his weakened wife. "I just want to know why, and then I'll leave." His words hurt Jill. Remorse and regret were written on her face as she weakly turned to her husband. Her eyes expressed all the grief and sadness that consumed her. She extended her hand, trying to reach her husband, despite the fact that he was standing a few steps from the bed. However, Mary took Jill's hand and gently patted the back of it, comforting her. This gesture interrupted Jill's movement, and she again looked away bitterly. "Do you want to know why? Because you're a real jerk, Steve. That's why. You're never around. Your stupid job is more important to you than her," his sister-in-law explained with venom in her voice. "She finally found someone who made her feel alive, who made her feel like a woman again. I'm happy for her. So just leave her so she can be happy with her new man." Jill turned back to Steve. It was obvious that she did not entirely share her sister's opinion. "I didn't want you to find out about it like that," she said softly. "I didn't mean to hurt you. You could have said something." "We could go see a psychologist," Steve said, sounding completely depressed. "The time for consultations has long passed." She found solace in the arms of a real man, Steve. So go back to your computers and let her move on with her life. Mary spat again. Mary, that's enough. Can you leave Steve and me alone? Jill asked in her weak state with a prayer in her voice. Mary rose reluctantly from her chair by the bed. Her dark eyes bore into Steve as if trying to rip his heart out. The temperature in the hospital room seemed to rise a couple of degrees when she finally left. Jill again extended her hand to her husband. Steve took a few steps into the room so they could talk in private, but he refused to take her hand. Jill noticed his pained expression and removed her hand. Yes, I should have told you, but I was so caught up in the whirlwind of events. I wish I could explain everything to you, Steve. Steve crossed his arms and said dryly, instead of wanting to, do it. I can't read your mind, Jill. I'm almost 40. I've already lived half of my life. Since the boys grew up, there was nothing left for me in the house. I needed something to fill this void, and you were always working, going on business trips. I felt lonely. Steve sighed heavily and shook his head. You could have told me about this. You could go on business trips with me. I've offered to rent a room for you countless times. We could spend the weekend before or after a business trip with just the two of us. I know, Steve. I know. Now I regret that I didn't agree, Jill said dejectedly. She looked at him with despair. But I don't think we could afford it. We would go into huge debt. I'd rather go into debt than let our marriage fail, Steve countered. Jill closed her eyes. Talking about the collapse of their marriage hurt her. She was silent, hoping that when she opened her eyes, it would all be a terrible nightmare that she could forget. Steve's voice interrupted her silent plea. And this Chris? Do you love him? I don't know, she answered, hoping that her uncertainty would satisfy her husband's curiosity. Steve's stony expression showed her that such hope was in vain. She continued, he's not you. He pays attention to me. He loves to garden. He likes my garden. He spends time with me. He makes me feel like what I love is important. He compliments me. He says how beautiful I am. He notices when I do a new hairstyle. Steve rolled his eyes. Listen, Gloria's boyfriend will say all this and do all this because he wants to sleep with you. The look of horror on Jill's face cost Steve all the money in the world when he mentioned the nickname Chris used to call himself to Gloria. However, Jill became defensive. She gathered her strength to answer. Are you saying that I'm not beautiful? Steve's shoulders slumped. No, that's not what I want to say at all. I think you're great. I thought I told you this often enough, but obviously I was wrong. Look, I'm sorry if I made you feel ugly or unloved. You know that I loved you. Everything I did for you and my family. Jill turned away, unable to look at her husband. She knew deep down that his words were true. Without looking at him, she asked, Can you forgive me? Forgive? Yes, Steve sighed heavily, trying to find the strength to continue the conversation. But I won't be able to forget what you did to me and to our marriage. Although, according to Mary, it seems that you have already come to terms with the end of our marriage and have filed for divorce. Jill turned to Steve. She raised her hand again to touch her husband. Her eyes begged for understanding. It's all because of Mary. If I could go back in time, I would change everything, Steve. Honestly, I'm so sorry. Steve shook his head. Woulda, coulda, shoulda, Jill. You can't change the past. When I returned home early and found you and Chris in our marital bed, my heart and love for you died. If I could go back in time, I definitely would not have come home earlier. But I can't change time, and now every time I see you or think about you, I see you together. Gritting his teeth, he added, I hear those hateful words you said then. They're stuck in my head, and I can't get rid of them, no matter how hard I try. Jill sank onto the hospital pillow, shocked by Steve's words. She frowned, trying to express her sincere repentance. Oh God, no, Steve, no, it was just sex, you know. Please understand, I didn't mean it like that. I haven't changed anything with you. Please believe me. I would like to, Jill. I would really like to, Steve replied. He turned to the door. Jill wanted to jump out of bed, run to her husband, and hold him so that he wouldn't leave. However, the accident deprived her of this opportunity. She gripped the bed rails and tried to miraculously force her body to obey. All she achieved was to make her drip bag jingle. A feeling of helplessness overwhelmed her, just as Steve felt helpless that fateful night when he discovered his wife's infidelity. "I won't resist divorce, Jill. The boys are already adults. There's enough equity in the house for you to live on. I'll move out and find myself an apartment. You can be happy with Chris, Gloria, and Dan, but you will have to explain to the boys why we are getting a divorce." Steve stopped in the doorway of the hospital room. He looked at Jill one last time. "Oh yes, I almost forgot. What's the forecast? What did the doctor say about your injury?" Jill tried her best to sound cheerful, even though the loss of her husband was hard to hide. He said it was too early to say anything. "We'll know more in a couple of days." But he noted that it was an incomplete spinal cord injury and that I would likely be able to walk again over time. There was silence in the room before Jill spoke again. "For now, I will live with my sister until the doctor allows me to be alone." Steve nodded and, gathering all his will, left the room. Her parting words did not lessen his suffering. "I'm so sorry, Steve. The city has never seemed as small as it does now. What used to be home and family became cold and uncaring. The buildings that mattered now seemed to be mere structures of stone, concrete, and wood. The streets that led to something exciting have become just a simple concrete road connecting these lifeless buildings. The only bright element was a fluorescent sign in front of a small school building that advertised the local high school's 25th reunion. The parking lot was filled with cars of various makes and models, but none of them were as luxurious as the BMW Roadster Steve arrived in. His walk to the side entrance of the school reminded him of the times when members of the football team would tease him by pulling on his underpants or knocking his books out of his hands. But all this is in the past. Steve didn't care as he stepped into the sacred territory that the players considered theirs. Inside the small school, people were dressed in a variety of ways, from casual to smart. Steve could easily determine a family's income level by their clothing choices. The workers wore jeans and a decent shirt. Middle managers opted for business casual styles, such as khakis or dress pants and a button-down shirt. And the administration people also preferred business casual, but added a sports jacket to look quite informal, but still inspire respect. Steve looked around the crowd, trying to find his wife. His gaze wandered around the dimly lit room until he noticed a woman with brown hair curled into soft curls but pulled up. She put on just enough makeup to look well-groomed without standing out. Dangling earrings emphasized the delicate lobes of her ears and the elegance of her neck. Her image sent a thrill through Steve's heart. At that moment, the woman noticed him and, leaning on her cane, walked towards him. "Steve, I didn't expect to see you here," she said with a hint of warmth in her voice. Her eyes, however, betrayed her reserve. Excitement, hope, and life danced within them. Steve smiled politely. "Well, I didn't expect to be here myself. But sometimes a man has to do what he has to do." He paused noticeably to look her up and down. "Jill, you look very beautiful tonight. I like what you did with the hair." Jill couldn't help but blush at the compliment. She raised her hand and straightened the hairpin at the back of her head. "Thank you, Steve. Do you seem to have lost weight?" Steve looked at himself, opening his sports jacket to show off his slender waist. "Yes, I'm tired of carrying around extra weight." His smile touched his lips, but the joy did not reach his eyes. "How are you, Jill? How's Chris?" Jill looked down, processing the painful question. She raised her head with a forced smile and answered. "Chris left town a few months after our divorce, Steve. Nobody wanted to hire an unemployed forklift operator. He said he would call as soon as he found a job, but I never heard from him." "I'm sorry to hear that, Jill. It's really a pity. I remember you saying that he makes you feel alive. You deserved this in your life." Jill sighed and shook her head. "Don't feel sorry for me, Steve. And don't pretend. Just say it. Say, 'I told you so.'" Steve simply shook his head, raising his hands. "Honestly, Jill, I survived everything. You said he made you happy, and I hoped he would. It's a shame he didn't turn out to be what you wanted him to be." Jill bit her lip and shifted her position, trying to look at Steve from a different angle. She frowned, trying to understand his body language and the true meaning of his words. "Well, how are you?" she asked. "I'm fine. I was offered a position as regional director of it at St. Mary's Hospital with the prospect of becoming director of information technology within a year. I never thought I would have a chance to take over as CIO, but now it's only a matter of time. How are you? How are you?" Jill smiled sincerely, knowing that Steve's dream had finally come true. "Steve, this is wonderful. I'm so happy for you. This is what you have always strived for." She shrugged her shoulders with some helplessness. "And me? I work as the head librarian at a local library. Nothing special, but it pays the bills." Steve nodded understandingly. "Well, you always loved books. Now you can share that love with your local community." Jill clicked her tongue, annoyed, but not at Steve. "Well, yes, we are increasingly moving into the digital age. Books in MP3 format, downloadable materials, internet access. We have paper books, but they are becoming less and less. The city is constantly cutting our budget, and we are increasingly dependent on donations." She wrinkled her nose. "So mostly they donate to us pulp novels." Steve couldn't help but laugh when he heard about this situation. "I'm sorry, Jill. This sounds terrible. I hope you get better donations in the future." The word future brought Jill back to the present. She could no longer contain her curiosity. "Are you here with someone, or alone?" "You would think I was alone," Steve answered mysteriously, again trying to look around the room. Jill realized the hidden meaning, and her shoulders slumped. Steve returned the favor. "And you? Since Chris is no longer in your life, have you found anyone?" Jill hesitated for a moment before finally speaking. "Well, I'm dating Jimmy, although I don't think it's serious. Now he works at the gym." She shook her head, shrugging slightly. "I swear he can't help but stare at others." "Does he work at the gym? What happened to his job as a police officer?" Jill laughed in response. "It seems there was some kind of clerical error and Chris's car was destroyed instead of being sent to the impound lot. Jimmy was blamed for everything. He denied any involvement, but was jealous of Chris. Even now, he is trying to figure out if he is better than Chris." Steve raised an eyebrow and asked his ex-wife, "Well, is he better?" "Only one person has truly turned my world upside down, Steve." Jill's look gave Steve the answer clearly. Her words touched him. But at that moment, Steve noticed the one he had been looking for since his arrival. He smiled warmly, which Jill took as an answer to her confession. "Jill, I'd like you to meet someone special," Steve said. Steve offered Jill his hand so she wouldn't have to use the cane on the shortcut. They approached a small group of women who were giggling like chickens in a henhouse. One of the women wore a small black dress that elegantly outlined her figure. Her long red hair with blonde streaks gave her a sophisticated look. Her small stature did not prevent her from radiating confidence and charm. She had her back to Steve and Jill. "Believe me, girls, I had to come up with the most ridiculous excuse to push him towards her." This advice was hard to swallow, but I wanted it to close all the gestalts. I didn't want there to be any doubt. I wanted it for myself and wasn't going to share it with the "what if," the redhead said. Steve cleared his throat, and the other women in the group tried to hold back their giggles. The redhead turned around and smiled brightly. She hugged Steve and kissed him on the lips. She didn't even notice Jill until the hug was over. "Jill, I'd like you to meet my wife, Amber," Steve said with a hint of pride and love. Jill's heart sank as Steve wrapped his arm around Amber's waist, leaving Jill to lean back on the wooden cane. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Jill, resigned to her fate, played the role of supportive friend to Steve and his beaming wife, Amber. Topics for conversation replaced each other. By the end of the evening, Steve had learned that Dan Hart had been forced to file for bankruptcy after losing most of his customers due to a system glitch that delayed his deliveries. Although he managed to maintain a small customer base, it was not enough to maintain a fleet of vehicles. After bankruptcy, the remainder of his fortune passed to Gloria in a divorce agreement. It also became known that Jonathan, the former financial director of the hospital, was fired. Steve never shared that he himself was nearly fired for violating HIPAA. When Jonathan caught Steve in violation, Steve threatened to sue him for sexual harassment. Jonathan became afraid and agreed to Steve's terms, which included a severance package equal to 2 of his annual salaries in exchange for Steve's silence. However, Jonathan's womanizing habits caught up with him, and karma took its toll. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.